I'm Warwick Henry, President of the Aviation Queensland, and welcome you tonight. In our usual place, we've got our Peter Dunn doing all the technical work in the background, the cameras, etc., and recording. Shortly, we're carrying on. I'm just going to mention that people in Brisbane, if they're listening to ABC Radio on 6:12 on Wednesday morning, they had a whole program about Archerfield Aerodrome. And Rebecca Livingston, the ABC presenter, interviewed the general manager of Archerfield, and it's Rod Parry, who has been very good to us here, allowing us to have use of the terminal building, waiting room for our meetings. And welcome all those who are here. A couple of other things. Mind you, please mute your telephones if they're not. And for those people who come to the meeting, I've got a pile of magazines around the corner you're welcome to have a look at and help yourself to. One of the things to make it worthwhile coming out instead of just sitting at home on Zoom. This is the last AHSAQ meeting for the year, and we'll be sending out renewal forms to members before very long. Hope you'll rejoin for next year. So this is our last meeting this year, as I'm saying. In January 27th, we'll be having John Mikowski, long-term AHSA member from down south, talking about Tasmanian tigers. And for February, there'll be air combat in the Falklands. David Smith, who flew Royal Navy Harriers there and had a couple of successes in air-to-air combat. For March, there'll be accident record analysis, the Piper Cherokee 6 series from 1960s to the present by Ian McDonald. He's obviously doing a lot of homework on Cherokee 6s. And April, a short history on air navigation by Jens. Now for our speaker tonight, AHSAQ member Alan Graham. I'll introduce him now, and his topic will be the Brisbane Zero. Alan.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll give you the mic.
Thank you. Well, as you can see there, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some information. I'm sure, though, that you already have some information in your minds about the Brisbane Zero. So I'd like to perhaps make it sort of semi-interactive a couple of times anyway. I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask you as well. That, by the way, is the Zero as it first came out, and we'll be touching on the structure of the Zero, the sequence in which some of the things happened. What I tried to do originally was put it into a time frame, but that wasn't quite working. So we'll just move on a little bit. My background is actually I'm an ex-Telstra Telecom technician, technical officer, and then moved into management development. And my focus was on quality, on leadership, on teams, and also on staff selection. So you might see a little bit of that coming out in, we all look through our own little glasses and our own perspective at times. So you'll see a little bit of me coming out a little bit later on. My information sources. One of the sources is this particular book, which is the top one you can see there, My American Hero. I was having a talk a couple of days ago out to the Trade Coast Central. They haven't got any at the moment, but they're expecting to get some more in early next year. So that's an excellent book for reference. The others that you can see there as well, a couple of familiar names, I'm sure, from Oz at War, Peter, Clive Warne. If that name's not familiar to you, the son of Flight Lieutenant Barty Warne, a nod from someone, thank you, and Owen Ferrier. Owen has sent me some information as well, which when I started looking at it, I thought, wow, this is some great stuff. But I've had that much information, trying to squash it down to a very small amount. Bob Tucker has some conversations with Bob as well out at Eagle Farm, and you can see a couple of others as well. Pacific Rex, ADF serials, National Archives of Australia, National Library of Australia, and so on. The second last one there, the Technical Intelligence Report number 163, was a great value, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on as well. And the last one on that particular line, the history of the 348 Fighter Group and 342nd Fighter Squadron. There are 3 references to Archerfield that I'll be touching on as well. So some links here. Okay, some of the terms used. talk about 3, 4, 5-letter acronyms, TAIU, ATIU, all of those. I even come across the McCoy unit as well. They all refer to the same thing. I didn't get too bogged down in the detail of that because as that emerges, it becomes quite confusing. Hangar 7, which we know is still at Eagle Farm, and the other couple of things. People sometimes are amazed that the terminology is USAF, but I'm sure in this room no one is amazed at that. My original goals were to fill in the what I termed the flight hours gap between the 69 hours that the A6M3 had on it when it arrived in America versus the 20.45 hours that were easily attributed to Captain Bill Ferrier. So my goal was that. I also wanted to identify the RAAF involvement, identify pilots, identify, as you can see up there, specific aircraft, perhaps tail code. And as you know, with any kind of research, other things emerge as you go down this particular sequence. My research is ongoing, and you can see my email address there. So if you want to contact me on anything you've got, anything you want me to share with you, please, that way. Tonight, what we'll be doing quickly for the process, we'll be going through identifying the A6M3, the one I've called obviously the Brisbane Zero. We'll also touch on the strategy to win the air war because that actually linked across to the construction or the reconstruction of the aircraft. But it goes a lot further, the strategy. Looking at the timeline, once again, the selection and recovery, the repair and manufacture, the ground testing, looking then at the key personnel. That will sort of fall out as we go through those other things. And the 3 degrees of separation are some linked stories associated with what actually happens. Nothing's an island, and there are some very interesting things. I had to trim some of them down, so perhaps if you ask me questions at the end, we can add a little bit to it. Identifying the Type 32-0. So that is the rebuilt one as well, and you'll see that coming up a couple of times. I'm just going to step through. As you can see, Mitsubishi built all of them, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on as well. One of the ways of identifying a Type 32 is the pitot tube on the port wing. The reason I say that is because some of the research I was doing, I kept saying, this looks different. There's something wrong about this particular photo. And they'd flip the photo. And that happens many times. So that's one identifier. The other identifier, the simple one, is the cut-off wings. The ducktail. People confuse the Zero with the Oscar very, very quickly and easily. The other for the Type 32, A6M3 Type 32, as you can see, the oil cooler. It's located at the back of the cowling, centerline underneath. And at the front, just there is the air intake. We'll have another shot in a few minutes to see that in more detail. The prop, a 3-bladed prop, rotating from the cockpit position, as you can see, in a clockwise direction. So in that particular photo, as you can see just there, is the air intake. And you'll also note that the on the port wing, the left wing, you'll see that vertical stripe. That's a landing gear indicator. There was one on the starboard wing as well, and that was there obviously to indicate physically when the gear was down and locked. The other thing about identifying all A6M3s, by the way, was pilot access, which was on the port side of the cockpit, and there are the foot pegs and handholds for the pilot to get on board. The trailing edge of the port wing was a no-step area, but you'll see a little bit later on how that's compromised. But anyway, the bottom foot peg is the one that you couldn't see. That was hidden behind that particular pilot. By the way, we'll come back to that pilot a little bit later on as well. That photo is, as you can see, from the Australian War Memorial. I'm going to step on. Identifying the Brisbane Zero. So what did they do to separate the Brisbane Zero? Well, when they recovered the parts, there was 2 different cowlings that they recovered, and they ended up being 2 different colours. One was a very dark colour, and one was a lighter colour. You'll see that change as we go through some of the photos. Radio mast. The radio mast is much shorter than on typical A6M3 Type 32, and some of them didn't have radio masts at all. The radio mast wires go to the port, the starboard stabiliser, and also the vertical stabiliser. They were playing around with that when they were rebuilding it, when they were trying to get the radio to work here.
It's the board factory in the background.
Thank you. Yes, full thank you. The national insignia, it changed as well for the photos. And these are, when you go through or have a look at some of the photos, you will note that the photos do change based upon when the aircraft was produced and what they were doing with it at the time. And of course, what was the standard national marking from the USAAF at that time as well. So there was the Japanese Hinamaru or meatball, the USAAF star. There's also some shots, as you've actually already seen, of the overpainted star, if you look very closely, the USAAF star and bar, and the USAAF star and bar with a blue surround. And they are obviously one of the few colour bits that you'll be seeing tonight. And you probably already know, by the way, the reason why they got rid of the red star, the red circle in the white star, which was?
Looks like a red Hinamaru.
It looks like a red Hinamaru.
Meatball.
The meatball, yep, exactly. So the other element that happened in the Brisbane Zero was it was coded as XJ001, but that looks like it was only done for admin purposes. I haven't come across any photo of that on the tail code. They did use it on some later ones. The XJ002 was used. X, by the way, for experimental, J for Japanese. That was in Australia. So I just wanted to draw your attention to the overpainted star. If you look really hard, can you see the overpainted star there? Very, very hard to see. Two heads, no. It's only a single seater there, this particular one. And there is just there is the overpainted star if you look really hard. Okay, I'm going to step on because there's a fair bit of material I've got to cover. Okay, in the Technical Intelligence Report number 163, it quotes as the paint finish was, as you can see up there, dove grey. The trim, the cowling was blue. Now, whether that was a dark blue, I've come across some data which indicates that what the USAAF used was the Corsair insignia blue for the cowling, but could be another light blue that they used as well. And they use this term trimmings for red. Frankly, I've got no idea what that is. Well, actually, I do have an idea, but I couldn't identify it clearly. And there's some variations in the photos. These are black and white photos, so the colour of the fuselage does change considerably, and I'm sure you will recognise that the basis of that being either the film, the stock, the processing, the age, the angle of the sun, and all those other technical complications. As far as, once again, getting back a bit of a zoom on that photo, you'll notice that there's no 20mm cannon muzzles showing. That's where the yellow circles are surrounding the leading edge of the wing. The other thing that's identified, as you can also see, when it was originally produced, they were using the original Japanese tyres, which were smooth tyres. They caused some issues and they didn't have that many of them, and they hunted around eventually and found some Allied Air Force or Allied tyres, which changed the look when you're looking at photos as well. So, given what I've just said, here's the question for you. Is that photo correct? You'll note, by the way, this is a photo from the Australian War Memorial. Is that photo correct? You've got it, Bob. Thank you. Yep, and you, Peter, obviously as well. So we'll come back to this photo as well, because that actually is a photo from the RAAF report, which came out in October of 1943, and that is also indicated as flying over Brisbane, but it's not. It's flying over Port Phillip Bay, so that is the correct orientation of the photo. Once again, you'll note, by the way, the insignia, national insignia at this time, it's the star and bar without the blue surround. Okay, I've identified or put this up for a couple of reasons. One is just to give a perspective of the geographical location of some of the key areas that we'll be touching on or mentioning. And if I can hold this still, we've got Milne Bay, Buna, Port Moresby. By the way, that track across there, that's Kokoda. That point just there comes into play, that's Cape Rodney. And of course, Townsville, the departure point for the Copiahe, thank you. And of course, Brisbane, Melbourne, down there, obviously. Melville Island, which is another wreck site, Darwin. Batchelor ended up being in there, and mainly because that's where MacArthur landed in his evacuation from the Philippines. Alice Springs, of course, that comes into play a little bit later on, but one which I'll only mention now, which is that little town there is called Terawee. Does anyone know what Terawee claim to fame is?
I shall return.
I shall return. The first recorded element of him at a press conference when he said, I shall return. So let's move on. The strategy to win the air war. So this gives an orientation as to why the aircraft was being rebuilt, but there was more to it, the recovery and the building of the aircraft, than just building the aircraft and flying it around. So it was to determine how the Allies were going to use their much heavier aircraft, less manoeuvrable aircraft against the Japanese Zeros. The Japanese Zeros at the very start of the war in the 1940s, now I said 1940s, not 1941, because there was a war being fought in China by the Flying Tigers, and the kill rate, not against the Flying Tigers, but about some Chinese aircraft, was something like 12 to 1. So 12 Chinese aircraft as against 1 Zero going down. The other element was determine design criteria for a new generation of Allied aircraft. There is a bit of a myth around that, by the way, because I've researched it. The Corsair, the F4F and the F6F were all on the design boards, all produced before they had any information about the Zero to use to implement into there. The other element buried in here, determine the production locations of aircraft and the location of component manufacturers. That was something else as well, which came out and beyond the scope of what we're going to be covering tonight. But that was about jam tinning and a few other terms, which I'm sorry, I'm not going to be touching on apart from that comment just then. The foundation of what was to become TAIU. I'm going to try and use TAIU, but my apologies if I don't. These are the two people that really were the foundation of it. Frank McCoy and Clyde Gessell. Frank McCoy, I'll just step on. He was appointed by MacArthur after having been selected by Kenny in June of 42 to lead this unit originally. So I'll be accurate. He originally was from the materials section of the Directorate of Intelligence, but it became Technical Intelligence Unit, and also this other term that I've come across as well, the McCoy unit in Victoria originally, but then up to the AMP building. McCoy was also instrumental in the development of the MacArthur Southwest Pacific Code System, so he co-developed and promoted that. We'll move on, we'll touch on that in a few minutes. He obviously was into promoting the role of TAIU, the selecting the team and the expansion of the team as their roles and responsibilities increased, and also the lessons learned from the A6M2s. These were at Melville Island and Cape Rodney. Remember, I pointed to those on the map. And he, in October 42, appointed Clyde Gessell to his particular role. So the MacArthur Code, Southwest Code System. In later life, McCoy referred to Francis Williams as one of the most brilliant men he's ever seen. And the research that I've done indicates that Francis Williams came up with this idea of using these code systems, and they're still to a greater or lesser extent used today. For the MacArthur system in the Second World War, male names for fighters, and I'm not going to go through all of that. Fighters, the Hap or Hamp. There's a story which we'll go into in a sec about Hap and Hamp, Oscar, Tony. Are there any other names, by the way, that you can think of immediately for fighters in the Second World War that come to mind? Like Frank, for example, was one as well. Yep. Okay, female names for bombers, Betty and so on. I'm going to move on because of timing, etc. Initially, the names for the selection came from Tennessee, which was not his home state. It was a state that he grew up in. This is Frank McCoy. And they used nicknames, etc., of RAF personnel. Hap was chosen to honour General Harry Hap Arnold, but oops, that was highly offended, and that's hence why we've got this Hap-Hamp issue. And then it was also called the Zeke 32, and it was also called the Zero. There's a photo from the US, from the National Library of Australia. There will always be an 81st, and this particular person. I think from my research at the moment, her name was Betty. She was the nurse, and it was a friend of Francis Williams that that name came from. Going to step a little bit back to lessons learned from the A6M2 from Melville Island. This was the first intact Zero that had been captured. So this precludes, or precedes, I should say, the Alaskan Zero. Unfortunately, what happened, untrained personnel were involved in the selection, in the recovery process, and it ended up being a bit of a mess. But I reckon they learned something from it. The Cape Rodney one. In the top left of the screen, you can see there, that's the A6M2 after it's been recovered, but unfortunately, the recovery team hacked off the port and starboard wings to fit it onto a truck. Unfortunately, also, the structure of an A6M2 in the Japanese aircraft is different to Western ones. They have a main spar going right across from port to starboard. When they cut the wings, they cut the main spar. So Allied fighters have, or Allied aircraft have the wings bolted on, as you know. So that was it in leaning against the Port Moresby hangar. This is it, the right photo in TAIU in around about June, no, it would have been July, August of 42. And then it was actually put on a parade in 1943 through Brisbane. That's the bottom photo, bottom left-hand photo you can see. It's incorrectly identified as having been shot down by the US Air Force. On the sign there, it says US Air Force. It actually struck a tree and crashed. We'll come back to that as well because, sorry, I forgot I'd put that one in. Bit of a zoom.
George Street.
George Street, that one, yeah. I reckon that what they did is that Frank McCoy was a very smart man, and he identified clearly the who, what, when, where, how, why that had to occur in the recovery of aircraft. And this emerges a little bit more in more detail when we're getting to the Buna Zero. Clyde Gessel. Clyde ended up being in charge of operations at Hangar 7 at Eagle Farm. He was called, his title was Chief Engineer. He was not an aeronautical engineer, but he did have something going for him. He had a photographic memory. And I think that comes into play a little bit later on as well. He was not just an office person, he was out in the field, and he was physically in the field at Buna with the team selecting the bits that ended up being the Brisbane Zero. Okay, selection, recovery and transportation. This occurred from about the 25th of January through to the 19th of February. Buna was hell, a green hell as the term has been used. The fighting was intense. This is a photo from the 11th of December, and you can see the yellow sections there, and there. They are damaged HAPs. The orange or peach sections, they're actually denoting wrecked HAMPs. So you can see it was quite intense. That was close to the end of the campaign and just before the TAIU staff were there. The donor aircraft, there were 3 A6M3 Type 32s that were identified as providing wings, fuselage, tail assembly. I'm not going to go in there. Other aircraft on the site, there were around about 15 altogether, were used for other components. And we'll get down into more detail on that a little bit later on. Having a look at V187, CN construction number is the terminology, and the Haukoku 870 was the patriotic number, which is, you'll see that emerge, as you can see just there, by the way, just there on the side of the aircraft. So that's the photo taken in about January of 1943. And you can start to notice a few things around there. The engine and the cowling for that particular, from that aircraft were used and selected for recovery. The grass, they estimated that aircraft had been there for about 4 months. There's other shots of the same aircraft. You can see the reason why it was there, that it was the damage to the port wing. and the pitot tube to come back to the pitot tube from earlier on. This is not colorized. This is a color shot from Time Life, but basically the same aircraft. Can't identify the Q aircraft in the top left-hand photo there. Can't identify what Q aircraft that is. And this is taken in about February. It's after the TIU team have been through and they've got their stuff. And you can see how the fuselage looks. And that is not from TIU staff. It is actually from other people gathering souvenirs. Q102, I'll step through these quickly. That's actually taken in December at the very end of the fighting. You can see the grass has not been cut down as yet. And you can see the troops looking at it. I'll have a look at on the port side of the main fuselage, see the crease going through there. And that's obviously concussion damage from bombs, etc., that exploded nearby. Other shots, you can see quite extensive holes. There was a lot of damage to these aircraft and a lot of work had to be done to get this aircraft together. But as most of my notes are on the screen as well. So the main fuselage and wings from this aircraft were used for the rebuild. And I'll just draw your attention before I move on to canopy condition. If you have a look, notice the canopy. We'll just flag that in your mind for a little bit. Okay. And this is during the recovery. Recovery team are under the port wing, as you can see there. And those bags, I think, obviously there to stop the sun as they're trying to recover the 20mm cannons out of the wings. Around the cockpit, I thought I'd show you one of the strengths of the A6M3 was it was particularly light, strong but light. And what they did, whoops, once again, is you see the holes that have been punched through. And even on the pilot seat, that's the pilot seat there. They took every opportunity to reduce the weight of the aircraft without significantly compromising the strength of the aircraft. Another interesting thing, by the way, for me anyway, that handle just there, that handle is actually used by the pilot to adjust his physical height. So he could adjust it up and down for taxiing an aircraft carrier landing. The red circle is around the end of one of the 7.7mm machine guns. There were two. They fired through synchronized and fired through the arc of the propeller. So whilst they were a Vickers type design, whilst they had a firing rate of around 600 rounds per minute, obviously when they've got to go through the propeller, the rate dropped down to around about 200 from what I've been able to work out. Other photos of the various damage sections, as you can see from Pacific Rex, that particular photo. And the last of the three major ones, when it was originally found buried in vegetation, and then some of the other things that you might notice is a bomb crater. Interestingly enough, Buna Airfield was 5 feet above sea level. So you can imagine and we'll see it in a little bit later on as well, the rainfall at that time of the year is around 10mm per day. They have an average of 30.4 days of rain, and that generally occurs in the afternoon. Recovering the 20mm cannon from an upturned wreck, and the circle, I think, I tried to work it out. What do you think it might be? My best guess is it's a water canteen and a handgun, probably a Colt 45 in there as well, perhaps. But recovering the 20mm cannon. Oops, we've seen that one. Bit larger bomb crater. And the troops, so this was taken in December at the end of the action. And that photo on the left, the caption in the Australian War Memorial states that as the first pictures ever taken of the new Type 0. Why TIU were up there is because of the Australian and American troops had seen these aircraft a little bit earlier, and its successful promotion of the TIU role, and then getting them up there for the recovery of this aircraft. Some other damage, that's a Betty bomber in the background, the tail end anyway. Okay, dismantling down to the beach. Step through this relatively quickly. You can see they're making use of whatever they can gather. The tripod from palm trees. That was the extent of their mechanical advantage, a Jeep and a trailer. The Saki engine weighs in at probably around about the 500, 550 kilo mark. When they worked out what they had to do to pull the thing apart, they identified, as I said a little bit earlier, the main spar going from port to starboard. That whole centre section is one piece, so they had to balance it on the Jeep and get it down to the beach. This is a comment from My Military Career by Clyde Gessel. And as you can see there, the Aussie artillery troops provided assistance and were fine help. The Aussies are swell to us here. I've included a couple of comments from Clyde Gessel as we go through this information. Loading it onto the barge, but there's some locals helping as well. And you can imagine altogether that section would weigh several hundred kilos as well. Quite awkward to get it on. Imagine you trying to get that onto a barge. As you can see, the barge is about 5 feet high. The tail end or the other end of the barge, there's 4 engines in there at the moment, on it at the moment. And that's the overall shot. Unfortunately, oops, sorry, I'm thinking ahead of myself. That's the total amount of the parts that were shipped. I'm not going to go into the detail there, but on technical intelligence report, it identifies as 4 engines, but Clyde Gessel's diary notes that there were 5 engines that were actually recovered. Not included on the list is an external drop or fuel tank. We'll see that a little bit later. The total mass of the recovered was around about the 7,000 kilo mark. This is the unfortunate bit. Unfortunately, they'd loaded it all on board. Storm came up. 3 engines fall into the sea. A hull cover is torn off. The barge sinks. Had to go get another barge. Added obviously several days delay to the recovery process. The new barge, though, was large enough to accommodate all the parts. The barge was moved about 30 kilometres southeast along the northern coast of New Guinea to a place called Oro Bay, and the parts were then transferred to a coastal freighter, the Lorena, and the Lorena sailed to Milne Bay on the 1st of February, and obviously at Milne Bay was transferred to a Liberty ship, the SS Stephen Johnson Field. Clyde wrote, after some frustrating mishaps and delays, I wish I had more rank so I could get some people off their butts. This problem is solved in a most unusual and unexpected way in a couple of months' time by what's called the MacArthur Pass, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. That is not a photo of the Stephen Johnson Field, but the Stephen Johnson Field was a typical cargo Liberty ship, thank you, Liberty ship. The Stephen Johnson Field was the hull number 85 of 2,711 that were originally built. 2,710 actually got into the slipways. Just an interesting side point here, by the way, is cargo ships and tankers, as much as you might see on movies from Hollywood, etc., and the U-boats looking through the periscope and saying, oh, that's a tanker, we're going to shoot the tanker. The profile of the tankers, Liberty ships, was the same as the cargo ship. They couldn't identify the difference through the periscope. The Stephen Johnson Field had its own story as well, and I'm not going to read all of that, but actually, whilst it was tied up in Milne Bay, it was attacked only about a week or so prior to Gessel getting there with the parts for the Brisbane Zero, and it was heavily damaged. The damage wasn't repaired until it got down to Brisbane with the parts. They did a temporary repair job. But as you can see, Clyde called the captain, he referred to the captain as Captain Good Enough. And he also wrote, as you can see there as well, that captain and crew act like a bunch of jerks. So the Stephen Johnson Field arrived in Brisbane on the 19th and the parts were unloaded on the railway wagons. Yes, there was a railway loop from Brett's Wharf to Hangar 7 or to Eagle Farm. The repair, manufacture and assembly of the Zero. longest time frame that we'll be addressing in real time, but the shortest number of photos that I've been able to pull together. Clyde Gessell, once again, his diary wrote that we may get around to actually starting something. So I can hear a little bit of his character coming out as well. He's getting frustrated, he wants to get in. The engines end up going down to Melbourne. The propellers go to Sydney for rebuild at de Havilland. In March, I've put this in as well because in March, ATIU was officially organised and McCoy and Gessell's material section becomes the US TAIU associated with the 5th Air Force. In April, the MacArthur Pass. MacArthur Pass. This is the MacArthur Pass, obviously, as you can see, for Clyde Gessell, and we'll step on, just pulled out a little bit. Every possible aid consistent with combat operations will be given this officer. He's a lieutenant, remember. It is directed that all necessary transportation, communication facilities, guards, rations, labour, vehicle fuels and parts be supplied on request without further authority or approval. So he used it in his diary. He notes he used it once. These are photos from inside Hangar 7. And if you know the story about Hangar 7 at the moment, that roof was only replaced about 1.5 years or so ago. It stood the test of time. It's now a new roof. We'll just step through some of the obvious bits, the wing, and you can see a little bit there of the canopy, but that's the wing of the A6M3. Some of the technicians, etc., doing work on it, and you can see the full canopy in there as well. And he looks a bit startled though with the photo, but he and the other gentleman behind him, who was hard to see, that's the firewall. The fuel tank is there. This was one of the weaknesses of the A6Ms in general, was that they had a tin can effectively as a fuel tank. Now, if you know much about evaporated fuel, you will know that a cup full of fuel evaporated in the right volume of air has the explosive impact of at least 3 sticks of dynamite. Hence why they blow up when they were hit. A lot of work was done in doing the repair work. Once again, you can see the holes to create lightness but maintain strength. And another shot there as well. And you'll notice, by the way, they've got a pad sitting on the base of the wing just to protect this no-step area. Because the wing was rather thin. Actually, USAF pilots were quite frightened when they were flying the aircraft in that they would see the wing actually rippling at speed. This is a photo from, I thought I'd include this because if you're here in Brisbane and you know the DFO out at Eagle Farm, there are 2 corridors in the DFO that have got some very great photos of the rebuild process. So,
All from me.
all from you. Thank you, Peter.
See my name down the bottom there.
Ah, right. Okay. Fantastic. Self-explanatory. Once again, you've seen that photo, self-explanatory. Cape Rodney A6. We saw all this before, but what I want to point out to you is that the canopies from the aircraft that were recovered from Buna were not usable. Technical Intelligence Report number 163 makes a statement that says in the bottom right, near the canopy from 3032, that's the construction numbers, or 3030 or 3032 were repairable, but one from a previously captured Zeke was fitted. This is where my one-on-one has come together. And if you have a look here, intact canopy. Why would they bother to take a canopy off if they weren't going to use it? In July of 43, no canopy. That, and all right, my one-on-one may not add up to 2, but that I think is the source of the canopy from the 4-hour Brisbane Zero. Once again, a tighter shot. Not going to go through all the people, but you can get an idea of the number of staff that were involved in the reconstruction process. We'll come back to a couple of those in a few minutes. ground testing and flights, moving on quickly. Planes that flew with the A6, whenever it flew around Brisbane, it had in company with it an allied aircraft. So at one point it's actually flying, and you'll see this in a few minutes, it's actually flying around Brisbane with the meatball or the Hino Maru on it. There are some allied aircraft with it as well. One of the allied aircraft that flew with it is the P-38 Lightning, and that's a P-38H, and it was P-38Hs that were in Brisbane at the same time as the Brisbane Zero was being rebuilt. That's the business end of the P-38, which you've probably seen in the past as well, and you can see how immense the firepower would have been when you're talking about concentration of firepower from 50 caliber projectiles. The myth, as everyone knows as well, by the way, there's a great myth about given the whole 9 yards, and there's some association that it's supposed to be the length of the ammunition belt feeding into 50 caliber machine guns. That is a complete and utter myth. I like P-38s, by the way. The P-40 was another aircraft that was flown with the Brisbane Zero, and you'll notice the terminology Warhawk, because they were called Warhawks in USAAF terminology. Kitty Hawks from an Australian point of view, that's at Milne Bay, and actually the pilot sitting in that aircraft at the time is according to the caption, is Bluey Truscott. Who is it? Bluey Truscott. Yep, thank you. I grew up with a nurse, and the nurse that I grew up with, who was my next door neighbour, she knew Bluey Truscott and used to tell stories, retell the stories. Obviously toned down as to what I was actually originally told, but the other aircraft is the Marauder. That's used quite often. And I think a couple of times it's actually the camera aircraft from shots we see. This aircraft is as you can see there, the Razorback version of the P-47. This from the 348 Fighter Group and the 342nd Squadron. I think, even though it says on the bottom at an unknown location, from the research I've done, I think that that photo was taken here. And there's a good reason for that as well. They're assembled at Eagle Farm, but they did their, here's a particular term, bedding in process for the engine. That's not the term they used, but they did a slow warm up or slow wearing in of the aircraft, and they were operating out of Archerfield. The reason I suggest that, by the way, that it's here is because that aircraft, as well as, hang on a sec, I'll just get, that aircraft is 428053, the tail code. That aircraft, and if you see in the bottom right, 428124, were actually destroyed on delivery up to New Guinea at Cooktown. My guess is that they wouldn't have had a cameraman or a photographer at Cooktown. So we'll come back to that aircraft a little bit later on, because it has a bit of a link to one of the pilots I've identified. And of course, the Spitfire Mark 5C. I'll step on. This is the Flying Fortress that was used by General Kenny, and that also is, has got links potentially to have been a camera platform. Start of testing, I'm going to start moving on. I'd like your opinion as well. That's clearly been identified as Captain Paul May. Do you think that's Captain Paul May as well?
Looks like it.
Looks like it to me. Yeah, the hat, the angle, the body language, the whole bit. Captain May was originally selected to be the test pilot. He rejected it on the grounds of safety. He identified the issue around the brake seizing, and they were an ongoing problem. All pilots were advised only use the brakes in an emergency. Bill Ferrier ended up being the chief test pilot, and he flew it for the 20.45 hours I mentioned a little bit earlier. FOMO. I don't know if FOMO at the time was the same terminology of FOMO that we use today, but that's actually out of there will always be an 81st. His nickname was FOMO. So I don't know whether it referred to fear of missing out as well then. So the first three flights. First flight, 20th of July 1943. I find it interesting, by the way, that that date comes up, because That's 12 months to the day when MacArthur shifted his headquarters from Melbourne up here to Brisbane. I think that might have been more than a coincidence. On the 22nd, there were 2 test flights. The first flight, relatively no issues. Second flight, unfortunately, the engine cut out and Bill Ferrier had to land the aircraft dead stick. The ground looped, as you can see there, the starboard landing gear ended up having to be replaced. And the 2 elements further on, I've already mentioned the first one. The second one, there were tail wheel modifications. They actually used the bomb release mechanism to lock the tail wheel to provide some degree of control. This is some still shots from the movie that was made. So I'm going to flash very quickly through most of this. Notice, by the way, I've said here, flashing through quickly, but stopping on this one, the blades are pristine. They had at least 2 sets of blades, one for ground testing and one for flying. And I think that they were rebuilt and coloured as per Allied standards. Cowling in place, spinner in place, that external fuel tank, outside hangar 7, using the forward motor tug to pull her out. You can see, by the way, the cowling cover very dark. Check the national insignia, very bright, very strong. Him standing on the no step area. Fired her up, spoilers, taking off, bit of flight. Notice the national insignia. You can hardly see it. It's supposed to be the same film. Redcliffe, Deception Bay, Hornibrook Highway in the background, the original bridge. It had been completed for a few years at the start of at this time. Yep.
On the ground, but on the aircraft, somewhere down there.
There was a Sandgate out of left base where a B-17 made a crash landing in what he thought was an airstrip. It wasn't.
A bit like the Alaskan Zero. I thought this is an airstrip. Oops. Okay. Stepping through, coming in for the end of that first flight. And now these are some shots. Once again, if you note the Japanese Hina Maru and the P-38 in the background with at least stars and bars on it. Just take note of the profile of the P-38, no external fuel tanks. There were 2 of them that were fitted inboard of the port and starboard wing pontoons, for want of a term. We'll come back to that in a few secs. He wasn't mucking around when he was flying this aircraft, because you can see how low, look at the shadow. He's not particular, the shadow is just there. So he's not too far off the ground. And Story Bridge in the background. See the tips of the Story Bridge. The HAMP, the Zero, the A6M3 is in there somewhere. I gave up trying to find it, but it's in there. And have a note, though, once again, of the P-38. There was supposedly only one in the air at the time. So there is 1 fuel tank, as you can see there. Moving on, I suspect that the camera aircraft was the Marauder. It was used quite often. And the P-38 banking starboard. Once again, the P-38 with no external fuel tank. And touchdown. Once again, notice the canopy. Once the engine cowling, I should say. It is very dark. And then the end of the film. This crew was the, I'll call it the prime crew. And that's Clyde Gessel. The next gentleman across here was the crew chief. The next gentleman across here was the instrument specialist. This gentleman, he was the hydraulics expert. And this gentleman here, Miles Robbins, he was the mechanic. These crew actually were the crew that followed the Brisbane Zero down to Melbourne as well. That's self-explanatory as to why I included it. You'll see that these two masts are going down to the port and starboard. I've got to move, I'll have to move on. Fuselage colour changing again. They're the fuel wing take. I said I didn't know what trimmings referred to as far as red's concerned. They're definitely painted a different colour. My suspicion is that that's part of the trimmings painted in red. This is something else which I find interesting. Apart from everyone else, but have a look in the bottom right hand of identified as Chan. They actually did have a Japanese pilot who was providing assistance for creating a checklist.
It might have been from Avis at Inverpilly.
That's my suspicion. I suspect Chan, to me, by the way, is not a Japanese name. So we'll call that a pseudonym. Okay. The pilots, these are the pilots that I've now identified. Captain Paul May, Captain Bill Ferrier, Squadron Leader Les Jackson. He was from Milne Bay as well, and you'll know that from your backgrounds. First Lieutenant Charles Whistler, Wing Commander, later to become Air Commodore Gel Cumming, and then of course some unknown pilots because I've still got a gap. This is Captain Paul May. He was involved in ground tests only. These are all the flights that Bill Ferrier made, total of 20.45 hours. And as we move down through them, just quickly, by the way, the American system, 0.5 hours refers to 30 minutes. The RAAF system, 0.5 hours refers to 50 minutes. RAAF flights, and we'll get down, not a secret anymore. It was originally a secret. When the Japanese aircraft was flying and a nurse actually reported a Japanese aircraft over Brisbane to the police said, no, you're wrong. It's all secret. Of course, it was a very loose secret around Eagle Farm. Anyway, not a secret anymore. Look at the date of the Courier Mail, Friday, the 27th of August, and it's on the front page. So you can probably get pretty much of a guess as to why are they doing this? Has the war turned around? Is this about public morale? We can only guess at this point. So as I said, total of 20.45 hours. This caption, once again, associated with this particular photo, puts this photo as having been taken on the 12th of August. And you'll see once again, we've got a very overpainted star. In the background is General Kenny's B-17. On some sites, by the way, I was looking at this photo and it was actually flipped over. I sent information off to the site to say, you've got it all wrong, and they fixed it up. So I was happy with that. In preparation for the flights, getting back to the RAAF flights here in Brisbane, well, were they in Brisbane? Down at Laverton, they modified 2 Spitfires. One was AR621 and the other was AR269. That's the correct terminology at the time. We know them now as G suits, but they were called, at the time, they were called anti-G suits, which when you think about it is an appropriate name. It describes what it does. Cotton is not the name of the material, cotton is the name of the professor. So the cotton aerodynamic anti-G suit and the relevant equipment that fitted into the AR621 was an air system. AR269, it was a hydraulic system. They required completely different systems. I suspect that the original plan, as you can see there, the first flight, there were 3 flights. The first flight was scheduled for the standard flight, and then one of the next flights was using the cotton system, and the plan was for the next one to be the Taylor or hydraulic system. Something happens to AR269, and I haven't been able to find any reference to it after this date. AR621 and AR269, as you can see the note there, that's the report in the background from the RAF. Both it came up and maintenance personnel came up in order to conduct the comparative test with the HAP. Notice, by the way, it's saying HAP in the RAAF, even though we are now in August, and even though it was back in late 42 when General Hap Arnold was offended. This is an interesting comment. AR 621, comparative tactical trials with Hap at Archerfield continuing. 1943 now. This is in August 14, 17 and 18. 1943. Squadron leader Les Jackson, he flew the Hap for a total of 6 hours. I got that information out of the National Archives of Australia. And that's actually a photocopy, as you can see there, of the highlighted section for his flight hours in the HAMP. Moving on, this is as you can see as well, it's a portrait from the Australian War Museum. I decided to include Barty Warren in here. He flew the Mark 5C on those dates, and he was the one who had the cotton suit on in those second and third flights. There's a photo I found of AR 621. The background, by the way, is ED 930Q for Queenie Lancaster. This photo, you can identify it by the fact that it's still got the British system markings on it. That puts this photo taken in June of 1943. The A58 terminology and A66 terminology for the Lancaster, the A58 terminology at least occurred in November of 43. Barty Warren wrote a report. I'm going to just skip over that. The point here that I find very interesting is that the report went to 452, 457 and 54 Squadron. Just as a sideline, no aircraft fitted with anti-G equipment was allowed to fly over enemy territory. So these were, and they were being used by pilots in those squadrons at the time. Clive, in his recollections many years later, he wrote, he found out that he actually bent the tail, or put a bend in the tail to be precise, of the Spitfire, somewhere between 9 and 15 degrees. As I said, he only found out that in the 1990s. By the way, also, as you can see there in the orange, I provided details of the Spitfire to Clive's son. He didn't have it. Another pilot, Charles Whistler, looking at an article in Aeroplane magazine in June of 1999, and quote, as you can see the quote there, "I flew the Zero in mock combat with Thunderbolts and Spitfires." So at the time he was a first lieutenant, and the P-47s were here at Archerfield. And once again, going back to that photo of the Razorback, oops, wrong photo, wrong button, I should say. In the bottom right-hand corner, 42854, one more from this aircraft. That was Lieutenant Whistler's aircraft. So Lieutenant Whistler's aircraft must have looked, I assume, very much like that. He crashed it in New Guinea on the 18th of October in 43, but he survived. This is a photo, once again. Don't know who these pilots are. My suspicion is that one of them could be Charles Whistler, who we identified a little bit earlier. And this is the, once again, that standard crew that I was talking about. Stepping on quickly, got this photo and I thought, hello, I've identified another pilot. Unfortunately, when I got this photo, and looking at his badge, it's a navigator's badge. So a win and a loss, but once again, as you're doing research, you end up going down particular paths. Not all of them work out. So Captain Ferrier's last flight was down to Laverton, about 4.5 hours, and that was on the 8th of September 43. And once again, you've seen all of these photos here. So it was accompanied, the Farrier flying the A6M3, the Brisbane Zero, it was accompanied by the Marauder. Laverton flights from the 9th to the 24th. And once again, the other comment, I think AR621 was also used again down in Melbourne, because the comment there, as you can see, being fitted with radio in preparation for arrival of HAP. Once again, Clyde made a comment about RWF types being really topped. Full armament was installed to get a true performance figure for the aircraft. There's a photo of Derek Cumming, as you can see. He flew it for a total of 16.55, so 16 hours, 55 minutes. And once again, from the National Archives data, you can see if you start tallying up, and that's only a fraction of his record. He was, you can see, for example, if we do a sidelight, 900 hours flying the Hudson. And he flew the Oscar, and he also flew the Tony on another page, which I didn't include. Okay, this is also interesting from my point of view, in that he was actually in Brisbane at Eagle Farm during the August flights by Jackson and by Bardi Warren, because this movement data here that I've highlighted indicates, you can't read it, it's pretty well damaged, but it said proceed by air to Eagle Farm 11/8/43 and returned by air to Laverton 19/8/43. That covers the tests at Eagle Farm by Les Jackson. Okay, last photos, we'll move through. That's once again that earlier photo that we saw. You can see. So that's out of the RWF report. Another photo from the RWF report on the tarmac outside of one of the hangars down at Laverton. And there's a photo of the Spitfire. I can only guess it, but once again, educated guess that that's AR621 and 621 flying over Melbourne. And the final flights in Australia, Laverton back to Eagle Farm, that occurred on the 24th of September, and Eagle Farm to Townsville somewhere 24th or 25th. So we're moving on. Second last flight in Australia, that was by Squadron Leader Cumming. And obviously what I've done is based his flight time on Bill Ferrier's flight time of 4.5 hours. And the final flight in Australia, unknown pilot, but that was from Brisbane up to Townsville. My guess is that occurred, on the 25th of September. Okay, I'll flick through these flights, photos from Townsville, loaded onto the Copahy, photo of the Copahy, which transported it intact. It wasn't disassembled, transported intact to the United States. That's just a summary of everything that I've just said with regard to hours. I've still got to identify some hours. My project, as I said, is ongoing. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. And I'm sure that will have prompted some questions. Any questions on the floor, first of all? Any questions from out in Zoom land? I see a hand waving. Is this turned on?
Yes, hello. Hello, this is Lloyd in Melbourne.
Yes, go.
Did you ever hear a story I read many years ago that Mr. Whackett was asked to examine a captured Zero, and he said that much of the structure was of Grumman design?
Grumman. Well, the other aspect is that the propellers were actually very much a steal from Hamilton, and the engine was very much a French design, a Rhone construction. So I wouldn't not be at all surprised by that. The British actually were providing a lot of assistance to the Japanese aeronautical industry up to about 1935. So you can only guess that would be completely accurate, especially from someone like Wacker.
Thank you.